I've prepared some premium steaks for everyone.
As Daniel and I sat down at the designated table, Emily brought in the steaks. She placed the plates in front of everyone except me, then sat down and began pouring drinks. I couldn't help but think to myself, if you need to label it as premium, then what's the deal with non-premium steaks? Are they expired or something? With that thought in my mind, I took my seat. What? As I was deep in thought, Brian noticed that there wasn't a plate for me and nudged Emily on the shoulder.
Hey, where's Victoria's steak?
Well, because I said I'd call my family today. Victoria isn't really family since she's not your biological mother, right?
Don't be ridiculous.
I felt as if I'd been struck by a hammer, but Brian and Daniel immediately began to criticize Emily. Their shouting was so loud that I worried it might wake the baby. No, it's fine. I'm not that hungry anyway. I tried to calm Brian and Daniel down. Unapologetic, Emily took a sip of her drink and a bite of steak, then smiled contentedly.
It's so delicious. Victoria, how does it taste? Oh, that's right. You're not really family, so I didn't prepare anything for you. My bad.
Brian glared at Emily with a look of utter frustration. It's true, I'm not Brian's biological mother. He's Daniel's son from his previous marriage, and it's a fact I've always accepted. After all, I've always had him call me Victoria instead of Mom, so perhaps I'm not truly family in that sense. But what about you, Emily? Are you really Brian and the baby's true family? I excused myself to use the restroom, leaving the living room, and made a phone call to someone. As the image of my peacefully sleeping grandson flashed in my mind, a wave of guilt washed over me, but I pressed the call button on my phone nonetheless. My name is Victoria. I married my husband, Daniel, who had been divorced once before, and I have been raising his son, Brian. I first met Brian when he was 7 years old, and even then, he was a sweet, well-behaved child who quickly warmed up to me. When I officially married Daniel, I made a point to have a serious conversation with young Brian. You don't have to call me Mom, just Victoria is fine. At first, my parents were against the idea of me remarrying a man with a child, but as they got to know Daniel, they came to understand and accepted our relationship, allowing us to live happily as a real family. Now that Brian is an adult, he's moved out of our house and settled nearby. He rented an apartment just a few blocks away from us, and I couldn't help but think, why not just live at home with us?
A man's got to do what a man's got to do.
But Daniel said with a knowing look, what do you mean by a man's got to do what a man's got to do? Are you saying women don't have their own struggles?
No, that's not what I mean. Men have their challenges, and so do women. Yeah, even dogs and cats. They have their own things too.
After Brian moved out and became independent, my life got much easier, and I had a lot more free time. Daniel runs an interior design company, and he's been working with our son Brian to eventually pass the business on to him. As a housewife, my favorite pastime is sitting on my favorite sofa with a book after I see Daniel off to work in the early morning and finish my chores. However, to be honest, I've never really enjoyed reading that much. I've always found that just a few pages in, my eyelids get heavy, and I start to feel sleepy. In fact, I read mostly to help me fall asleep, so I do feel a bit guilty toward the authors of those classic literary works that end up being my bedtime aids. That's why I sometimes borrow children's picture books from the library to mix things up. Lately, I've been enjoying a rather quiet hobby of looking through bird guides and matching the bird calls I hear from the nearby woods with the birds in the book. On one early summer holiday, the soothing call of a cuckoo bird echoed through the fresh green leaves outside the window. I was sitting on the sofa with my bird guide, almost laughing as I glanced at Daniel, who was gazing at the sky. Did you know that the cuckoo lays its eggs in other birds' nests and lets them raise its chicks?
That's brood parasitism, right? I saw something about that on TV. It's incredible. The chick grows faster than the others and even pushes the real offspring out of the nest so it can be the one to get fed.
It really is an amazing behavior. Although the reason why the cuckoo lays its eggs in other bird nests isn't fully understood, there must be some important reason behind it. If the best way to ensure your child's survival was such a strategy. For some reason, I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness and sadness, but Daniel, with his arms crossed, put on an exaggeratedly thoughtful expression.
But still, it's pretty unfair, don't you think? Just laying eggs and leaving the hard work of raising them to someone else.
I chuckled softly. Knowing that the cuckoo, with its enchanting song, was raised through brood parasitism, Daniel was likely still caught up in the beauty of the moment. I closed the bird guide I had been holding and, lost in my own thoughts, let my heavy eyelids gently close. Several years passed like this, and now Brian had turned 30.
I have someone I'd like you to meet, Victoria.
The next weekend, Brian brought over his fiancée, a woman named Emily, who was 3 years older than him. I was excited that day. I even had a feeling that something wonderful was about to begin. I gazed out the window from the cool, air-conditioned room. The sunlight was probably so intense that the green plants in the neighborhood might have been crying out in distress. It was an extremely hot Sunday in the middle of summer. Emily brought what looked like an expensive treat as a gift, neatly packed in a bag from a well-known department store, and handed it to me without saying a word. Assuming she was nervous, I smiled and said, "Thank you. Please make yourself at home."
Thanks.
Emily responded with a brief, somewhat aloof greeting. Since it was the first time Brian had brought a woman home, Daniel seemed incredibly excited. He kept wandering around the room, unable to sit still, and even came into the kitchen for no reason, hovering behind me.
What kind of beans are those?
Daniel asked with a serious expression as I was brewing coffee for everyone. "They're from overseas." Afterward, I brought the mugs of coffee into the living room where Brian and Emily were reading magazines, and the four of us sat facing each other. As Brian gently petted the cat that had snuggled up to him, he took a sip from his mug, and Emily, sitting next to him, did the same.
This is Emily. Dad already know her, but we work together at the same place.
"Oh, is that so? Then I'm the only one meeting her for the first time," I said with a smile. Watching Emily's behavior, I started to worry if I had done something wrong. Emily seemed restless, glancing up at the ceiling as if bored, and occasionally taking her phone out of her bag. This was my first time meeting Emily. Yet, she remained silent without even introducing herself. What could this mean? Sensing my unease, Daniel quickly added,
Actually, Victoria, Brian had talked to me beforehand about this.
As it turned out, this visit wasn't just to introduce Brian's girlfriend. They were also here to announce that Emily was pregnant. The pregnancy had come as a surprise, But Brian, who loves children, was overjoyed and immediately proposed. Naturally, this led to the decision to meet each other's parents right away, which is why we were all together today.
To be honest, I wasn't really thinking about marriage yet, so I'm not sure what's going to happen from here.
Emily spoke in a vague, almost detached manner, as if this were someone else's situation. I tilted my head slightly. Maybe this wasn't a planned pregnancy. Emily is still young, and perhaps she hasn't fully realized what it means to become a parent. As a more experienced woman, I wondered if there was something I could do to help. If you ever need anything, I'm here to help. After I said that and gave her my warmest smile, Emily glanced at me, then with a somewhat tired expression, shifted her gaze to the window and let out a small sigh.
You know, you seem a bit fake.
Hey, Emily.
What? Do you have a problem with that? It's not like I even want to get married. I'm only doing this because Brian insisted.
Brian slumped his shoulders, silently apologizing to me with his eyes. Daniel also shrugged and looked down. I couldn't help but think that Brian had chosen a rather difficult person as his fiancée. Emily's assertiveness seemed less like strength and more like a desire to dominate the marriage from the start. Well, if Brian is okay with it, then so be it.
Anyway, the three of us, me, Emily, and the baby, are going to do our best as a family. So please continue to let me work at your company, Dad.
Brian's serious expression already bore the weight of someone ready to be the head of a household. Seeing him like this reminded me of the little boy he once was, and I felt a warm tear slip down my cheek.
Such a phony.
Emily muttered, but everyone pretended not to hear. Emily stopped Brian from introducing her again, and instead began boasting about her background. She proudly shared that her parents ran a successful business, which was doing so well that they had left most of the operations to their employees and had already retired. She participated in extracurricular activities like piano, swimming, and art classes from a young age. She also indulged in elite experiences such as violin lessons and horseback riding. These activities seemed more about flaunting wealth than anything else. She went on to mention that she excelled in school and graduated from a prestigious university that everyone knew.
So, Victoria, which university did you graduate from?
Emily asked with a slight, mocking smile. Judging by her expression, I suspected she already knew from Brian that I hadn't attended college. Well, it's true that not having a degree has always been a bit of an insecurity for me, which is why I've been desperately reading all sorts of books to broaden my knowledge. Glancing at the pile of unread books stacked in the corner of the room, I forced a small, rueful smile. I didn't go to college. My family was a bit poor, so I had to start working.
Oh, I see. So, you married for money and snatched the position of the second wife. Impressive.
Emily laughed heartily, holding her stomach, but Brian quickly scolded her harshly.
Stop it. That's disrespectful to Victoria.
In response, Emily pointed her finger right in Brian's face and snapped back.
I'm going to give birth to your heir. I want it to be clear right now who should be the top priority. If you've got a problem with that, we don't have to get married. And I'm perfectly fine with getting divorced anytime.
Emily's aggressive stance felt like a threat toward all of us. As I marveled at how Brian managed to find such a strong-willed woman, he shot me his second silent apology of the day. For a first meeting, this would definitely fall into the disastrous category, but for Brian's sake, I kept reminding myself to stay positive, and I think I managed to maintain a smile throughout the entire ordeal. As time went on, the seemingly endless summer came to an end, and before I knew it, the freezing winter had arrived. In early summer, cuckoo birds would gather every morning in the small patch of woods on the other side of the house. Their loud calls, combined with the heat, were a source of stress, but as the seasons changed, I somehow forgot about it. One cold morning, when my breath was visible in the air, I received a call informing me that Emily had given birth to a baby boy. Brian's voice on the other end of the line was full of excitement, and he was practically shouting, unable to express the overwhelming emotion of becoming a father.
The baby's here. He's here, Victoria.
Calm down, I told Brian, trying to help him regain his composure. I'd like to visit this Sunday, so keep your schedule open. A few days later, I decided to head to the department store alone to buy a gift. Knowing how strong-willed Emily is, no matter what I give, she'll probably make some snide comment. I had the staff wrap a luxurious set of baby clothes from a well-known brand and began my journey home. On the way back, I happened to pass by Brian and Emily's house, where I saw a man I didn't recognize ringing their doorbell. I intended to walk by without paying much attention, but when I saw Emily come to the door and chat cheerfully with the man, I felt an odd sense of unease and discreetly took a photo with my phone. When Emily invited the man inside, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. The following Sunday, I visited their home with a gift to celebrate the birth of my first grandchild. Brian greeted us with a joyful expression and led us to the baby's crib. Daniel and I gazed at our grandson, commenting on whom he resembled, his eyes, his nose, as he lay quietly in the crib.
I've prepared some premium steaks for everyone.
As Daniel and I sat down at the designated table, Emily brought in the steaks. She placed the plates in front of everyone except me, then sat down and began pouring drinks. I couldn't help but think to myself, if you need to label it as premium, then what's the deal with non-premium steaks? Are they expired or something? With that thought in my mind, I took my seat. What? As I was deep in thought, Brian noticed that there wasn't a plate for me and nudged Emily on the shoulder.
Hey, where's Victoria's steak?
Well, because I said I'd call my family today. Victoria isn't really family since she's not your biological mother, right?
Don't be ridiculous.
I felt as if I'd been struck by a hammer, but Brian and Daniel immediately began to criticize Emily. Their shouting was so loud that I worried it might wake the baby. No, it's fine. I'm not that hungry anyway. I tried to calm Brian and Daniel down. Unapologetic, Emily took a sip of her drink and a bite of steak, then smiled contentedly.
It's so delicious. Victoria, how does it taste? Oh, that's right. You're not really family, so I didn't prepare anything for you. My bad.
Brian glared at Emily with a look of utter frustration. It's true, I'm not Brian's biological mother. He's Daniel's son from his previous marriage, and it's a fact I've always accepted. After all, I've always had him call me Victoria instead of Mom, so perhaps I'm not truly family in that sense. But what about you, Emily? Are you really Brian and the baby's true family? I excused myself to use the restroom, leaving the living room, and made a phone call to someone. As the image of my peacefully sleeping grandson flashed in my mind, a wave of guilt washed over me. but I pressed the call button on my phone nonetheless. After a while, the doorbell rang. While Brian and Emily exchanged puzzled glances, neither of them moved, so I went to the door and opened it. "It's been a while." I greeted the visitor and invited her into the house. As I led her into the living room, Daniel and Brian were left speechless, their mouths hanging open.
Oh, Sarah, why are you here?
The person I had called was Sarah, Daniel's ex-wife and Brian's biological mother. Sarah and Daniel had divorced not because of hatred, but due to their demanding careers as business owners, which left little time for family. I had known this since I met Daniel, and I had even asked him not to sever ties with Sarah for Brian's sake. Over time, the four of us developed a relationship where we could even share meals together, fully aware that this was far from conventional by most people's standards. So when the topic of Brian's marriage came up, Sarah herself suggested that it would be better for appearances if we stopped seeing each other for a while. Emily, who had never met Sarah, was clearly baffled and didn't know how to react to this unexpected guest. Without any preamble, Sarah carefully laid a few photographs on the table for everyone to see. In the photos, Emily was arm in arm with a young man who was not Brian, both smiling warmly.
"This is you and your ex-boyfriend, right, Emily? Recognize him?"
Her tone was sharp. Sarah's voice, though questioning, carried an air of certainty that filled the room with tension.
What? Who are you? Is spying on people your hobby?
Ignoring Emily's provocative attitude, Sarah calmly took out a card holder from her jacket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to her. Emily glanced down at the card, her expression changing dramatically when she saw that in addition to Sarah's name, it also identified her as a private investigator. She frowned deeply and glared at me suspiciously. Emily then shot me a look that seemed to ask if I had hired a private investigator, before quietly sitting back down and crossing her arms.
You must have a lot of free time on your hands, Victoria. Hiring a private detective to get pictures of me running into my ex-boyfriend completely by chance. I might add, and acting like you've won something. That must have made you really happy.
It's true that these photos alone don't prove infidelity.
Sorry about that. If you really wanted steak that badly, you could have just said so.
Sarah's expression didn't change. She maintained her role as a private investigator, refraining from mentioning that she was Daniel's ex-wife, and continued to present her findings in a matter-of-fact manner. To summarize, this is what Sarah revealed. Emily was indeed still involved with her ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had never ended, and it had continued even after she got engaged to Brian. In fact, there was never a real breakup between them. When Sarah revealed that the ex-boyfriend's name was Mike, Emily flinched for just a moment, but quickly glared at Sarah.
So what?
Sarah concluded with a very elegant smile.
"But you know, I gave Mike a little money and asked him to share some details. He had some really interesting things to say."
Emily's face twisted with fear. As I watched her expression, it felt as though the warm, heated room suddenly grew cold. The person responsible for this chill continued her explanation with a confident smile, and I already knew what was coming. I had already heard this before.
Mike, after getting some money, confessed that he is the real father of the child you had with Brian.
That's a lie.
As soon as Sarah told this to Emily, she immediately denied it, crumpling up the photos of her and Mike that were on the table and throwing them against the wall.
Fine, I admit I was dating Mike. But to give him money and then believe whatever nonsense he says, and use that to insult me. This is defamation, you know?
Then you're saying that the baby is really Brian's? Can I trust you on that?
You're the worst stepmother ever, Victoria. I never want anything to do with you again. Brian, you better take control of Daniel's company as soon as possible.
Emily screamed hysterically. I leaned closer to Brian and whispered in his ear, "Bring me the baby's health record." Brian looked at me with a pained expression, searching my eyes for my true intentions. After a moment, he sighed in resignation, stood up, and retrieved the health record from a drawer, handing it to me. I opened the brand new record, and on the first page was the baby's blood type. It was a blood type that, as I had already known, couldn't possibly result from Emily and Brian. Though it's often said that a newborn's blood type isn't reliable, I spoke up. "We can do a DNA test if you like, but that baby isn't Brian's." As soon as I finished speaking, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the fierce crying of the baby from the other room. The sound filled me with deep unease. For a moment, everyone stood in silence. Then, Brian quietly got up, went to the bed, picked up the baby, and gently began to soothe him. With an awkward grip and a slightly fearful expression, Brian held the baby in his arms, looking as if he was about to burst into tears. I regretted not telling him the truth sooner. The baby Brian was holding, as he himself knew, was not his own. There was no reason to love someone else's child. In the bird guide I had read, it mentioned that most cuckoo eggs, laid in the nests of other birds through brood parasitism, are recognized as different and kicked out of the nest or abandoned by the parent birds after hatching. No matter how much that child cries or suffers, it's no longer Brian's concern. I had an overwhelming urge to take the child from Brian, shove him into Emily's arms, and throw her out of the house, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was torn by this inner conflict. Sarah continued to reveal more about Emily. Emily was not, as she had claimed, the daughter of a company president. In fact, her parents didn't even have steady jobs. Moreover, her parents were addicted to gambling, and because of her poor upbringing, Emily hadn't even properly attended college. She had been instructed to lie extensively to her friends and deceive them, leading to her relationship with Brian. From the very beginning of their relationship, Emily had been lying about being the daughter of a wealthy family. From the first time I met Emily, I had never been impressed by her manners or speech, and I had always found something suspicious about her. But thinking about how much Brian was looking forward to the birth of their child, I couldn't bring myself to investigate her background earlier. Brian, who had been quietly soothing the baby until now, finally placed the now sleeping child gently back into the crib. He held the baby's tiny hand for a moment, deep in thought, before slowly letting go.
Were you planning to make me raise Mike's child?
Wait a minute. This is insane. You're all trying to set me up, aren't you? I don't even know for sure. Maybe it really is your child, right? There's a chance.
So, there's also a chance it's Mike's child?
As Emily struggled to find an answer, Brian turned to Sarah.
You have it ready, right?
Sarah stuck out her tongue slightly before pulling out an unsigned divorce agreement and handing it to him. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Emily desperately clung to Brian's feet, but he mercilessly slammed the divorce papers onto the table.
We're getting divorced right now. and I'll make sure you pay for this.
As Emily cried and pleaded for forgiveness, I couldn't muster any sympathy for her. After all, she had intended to make Brian raise another man's child while continuing her relationship with Mike. You married for money. Even to the bitter end, Emily glared at me with hatred in her eyes. She continued to stare daggers at me long after. In the end, Emily and Brian divorced. Although Emily eventually admitted to her affair, she insisted that the child's paternity was still unclear and stubbornly tried to claim child support. At first, Brian seemed a bit sympathetic toward her. If you leave someone like her hanging, she'll just come back. After that, he decided to take a firm stance. The DNA test later revealed, without a doubt, that the child was not biologically Brian's. At that moment, I felt something, perhaps a sense of conscience, begin to dissolve quietly. The skilled lawyer that Sarah arranged demanded a large sum in alimony from Emily. Mike, likely not wanting to get entangled in Emily's financial troubles, abandoned her without hesitation and fled. Neither Emily nor her parents had any significant savings or sources of income, and it was determined that they were incapable of raising the child under these circumstances. As a result, the child was put up for adoption by distant relatives. Emily, now alone after losing both her lover and her child, fell into mental illness and is reportedly undergoing treatment. A few years later, Brian married a wonderful woman introduced to him by Sarah, and they had a child together. I made sure to explain everything about the previous ordeal to Brian's new wife, ensuring she understood that Brian had nothing to hide. She was also understanding of Brian's ongoing relationship with Sarah, and when their first child was born, they even invited Daniel, Sarah, and me to celebrate with a family dinner. At that dinner, just like on that fateful day, premium steaks were served. What had once been a source of tension had become a memory that would likely fade into the recesses of our minds. At one point, as I saw Brian looking at his newborn with a somewhat sad expression, I couldn't help but give him a pat on the back.
Ouch! What was that for?
Just focus on raising your own child. If you worry too much about others, you might end up neglecting what truly matters most.
I know, but
You're this child's father. That's all that matters now. In truth, I'm still struggling. How could I not wonder what kind of life that child, abandoned by both his mother and father, will lead, even if he isn't my own? I know I'll continue to wrestle with these thoughts for a long time. I took a bite of my steak. The tears that welled up, just for a moment, I decided to dedicate to Emily, who, in the end, I felt a small measure of sympathy for.